Hello, hello. Today we have Dr. Jordan Grumet on the Brothers on Books podcast, and I think I just butchered that again, even though we just talked about it. Uh,
Grumet,
so we're talking
close.
Grumet. God, it's like I just heard it and I can't even get it right. So we're talking about your book, Taking Stock, which I thought was, I really enjoyed it, and it was a very easy read. So, and your writing's very easy to digest. But I guess just sort of as a quick Q&A, the first question I had really, so in your book, I feel like you're sort of alluding to the fact that people lose sight of the purpose of money. So I guess if you just wanted in your own terms, maybe define how you view money or how you think money should be thought of.
Well, first of all, Alex and Jack, thank you for having me on the show. Yeah, I think we miss this basic concept. We think of money as a goal. And in fact, people dream of being rich if they're on the ball and they're saving and they're budgeting and doing all those great things. They start thinking about net worth. They start dreaming about some number. How many times have you heard people say, if I just had $1 million or if I just had $2 million? The problem is in the pursuit of money, we often lose track of the fact that money as a goal really doesn't mean much. Actually, it's a tool to help us live more purposeful lives. And when we lose track of that, we start thinking about money as the goal. And I think this serves a purpose because I think it's a really easy goal, right? Not necessarily easy to get all that money you want, but easy to figure out how to plan towards it. You can get a better job. You can do some side hustles. You can work longer hours. I mean, these are things we can kind of plan out. And so we stick with this easier stuff. The harder stuff is to start thinking about, well, how do I want that money to actually serve me? What's purposeful in my life? If I had an unlimited amount of money, what would I be doing with myself to find meaning and to do those things that were important? And so that's the way I fundamentally think we see money incorrectly.
So Jordan, a big thing that you talk about throughout the book is identity, purpose, and connection. So how should we go about putting that into our own character, and what questions should we be asking ourselves to better answer those types of questions?
You know, it's a great question. Purpose, identity, and connections. I love to say these, they roll off my lips and I speak about them in the book all the time. But the truth of the matter is, a lot of people, when they see me in person, they say, but how the hell do I know what my purpose is? And so my theory is that we have to think of purpose, identity, connections first. Then once we do that, we have to start working on our financial plan. And the last piece is to decide how we figure out whether to spend today versus spend tomorrow. But to get to any of those other questions, we really have to figure out who we are and what we want. That's purpose, identity, and connections. In the book, I go through a series of exercises. I am a hospice doctor. That means I take care of people at the end of life, but I also blog and podcast about personal finance. And in my work in personal finance, trying to answer these difficult questions like what's the purpose of money? And once we figure out how to get our finances in order, what next? I started getting the answers from my hospice patients because they had this privilege, and I hate to use the word privilege because it makes it seem like something positive, and I guess in a sense it is. They had the privilege of having the honesty and the ability to let go of all societal expectations, let go of all their previous expectations, and start thinking about what they really wanted in life. So let's talk about purpose, because that's that big question. How do I find purpose? Well, one thing I like to steal from the dying is something that we call the life review. When we're working with hospice people, often we'll sit down and ask them a series of structured questions about their lives, what they did, what they didn't do, what they wish they had done, issues with relationships, and what they hope to accomplish with the rest of their life. This is called the life review. And I love to use that as a tool when I'm asking younger people, people who are not terminally ill, how to think about purpose. The easiest way is to kind of look at this visualization and ask yourself the question, if I was on my deathbed bemoaning my life and saying something to the extent of, I really regret that I never had the energy, courage, or time to, like whatever comes next in that sentence is germane to your sense of purpose. So I really like to get people, when they're trying to figure out what their purpose is to really start thinking about, well, if I was on my deathbed, what is that little secret thing that I've always wanted to do, or that people always told me I couldn't do, or that I always wanted to try, but I never had the courage because I was afraid that I was going to fail. So I think that's a really good stepping stone for thinking about purpose. There are lots of other ways to do this. Another question I like to pose to people is, when was the last time you woke up in the middle of the night totally excited by an idea and you couldn't get to sleep? Did you pursue that idea? Often we get these inklings of these things that really feel like purpose to us, and we deny them. We go back to bed, we wake up the next day, we go to work, and we never think about it again. So those are some questions I think that can help you with purpose. The next is identity. When it comes to identity, I love the exercise where you say the statement or ask yourself, I am, and then you fill in the blank. Now, if you've ever done this, the first thing that usually pops up is you'll say, I am. And the first thing that always people come to is their profession. I know when I did this the first time, I said, I am a doctor, which is funny because I don't really identify as much that way, but I certainly used to. If you keep on playing that out and digging deeper and deeper, you eventually get to family relationships. I am a father, a son, a spouse. Once you go past some of those, you get to achievements. I am an award winner for this and that and what have you. But eventually, if you keep on asking that question, you get into more the core of who you are. I got to this point of I am a communicator. I'm a podcaster, a blogger, a public speaker. And when I started identifying that way, it really helped me understand my purpose, this idea of having these great conversations. And then when you start figuring out purpose and identity, they naturally lead to connections. So once I left that identity of being a physician and started thinking that my purpose was to have these deeper discussions about personal finance, I started to go to personal finance conferences, and I felt more connected to those people than ever before. So that's a lot to take in one answer, but purpose, identity, and connections, a few exercises that help us. I think if you figure out the purpose and identity, the connections naturally follow.
I guess going off that thought, you kind of want to maybe talk about how you feel like your identity transferred from maybe being a doctor, like the journey you took from feeling like you identify as a doctor to more of like a personal finance, like podcaster or communicator, and like how that, because that's probably an unusual path, correct?
Yeah, I would say that I'm one of the very few hospice doctor / personal finance experts, if not maybe the only in the world. So I was working as a doctor and I was feeling a profound sense of burnout. The hours were difficult. I didn't feel like I was changing people's lives as much as I wanted to. The administrative paperwork was huge, and I found myself struggling with purpose. I didn't want to do this anymore. And yet I was acutely aware of this idea that I was making a lot of money as a doctor and I needed that to survive. So because of that struggle, I eventually discovered the world of financial independence. This guy, Jim Dolly, sent me his book. I was blogging about medicine at the time. He sent me his book to review for my medical blog, but it was a personal finance book. And it introduced me to this concept of financial independence and how we could extract ourselves from the workplace by saving up enough money and investing wisely. When I looked at my own finances, I realized, hey, I'm pretty much there. I actually have enough money. I could leave medicine right away and I'd be done, and that would be it. And I was really excited and jubilant about that idea all of a minute. And then I had a panic attack when I realized I would be leaving the only identity that I had ever known. So I started to really explore this idea of who am I outside of being a doctor, as opposed to leaving the profession of medicine totally. I just started subtracting out the things I didn't want to do anymore. So the on-call hours, the nights, the weekends. Eventually what I was left with was hospice work, taking care of the terminally ill, something I would do even if you weren't paying me for it. So I kind of knew for me that was a big part of my purpose and identity. But in the meantime, I started exploring this idea of financial independence and personal finance. I started a personal finance blog, eventually a podcast. And so I was spending all this time with financial people talking about the meaning of money and what we should be doing from it. And again, that seemed to circle back on my work with hospice patients who were given that ultimate diagnosis and had to talk about what was really important to them. And none of them were speaking about money. None of them were saying, I wish I had worked more weekends. I'd wish I'd worked more holidays. I wish I'd gotten that extra raise. That isn't what people regret. It was more about the people and the things and the ideas and the courage that they didn't have to be true to themselves. And so in a sense, I saw this connection that maybe very few other people would see, is that the dying really had something to teach us all. And a big part of that is understanding money and the role that money plays in our lives.
Can you give maybe one or two examples of an end-of-life experience that really touched you?
Oh my God, there are so many. I love to talk about one of them, a patient of mine who I've changed the names on all my patients and some of the details, obviously, so you can identify them. But I had this patient, Ernesto, who in his 20s did something most people wouldn't do. He was a high-paid corporate worker. He took a year off of work. Think about this, his highest paid years. He was building his career, took a year off of work to train and then to go climb Mount Everest. And so in his 20s, he tries to climb Mount Everest after training for months and months and months. He gets there. They make it about halfway up. The weather changes. They can't go any further. He goes back down. He's done. He's got to go back to work. He's done his year. He's finished. He ended up dying in his 40s of leukemia, and we took care of him for the last few months of his life. And all he could do was talk about his climb on Mount Everest. You see, he didn't care that he didn't succeed. But we talk about how money compounds, and people say, okay, if you're in your 20s and you make lots of money, you can take that money, put it in the stock market, it's going to compound, and you're going to have huge amounts of wealth in your 40s. Well, Ernesto showed us that you can stop making money and go have an amazing experience. And for Ernesto, this experience compounded over the years. It became a true investment in his life. And when he was on his deathbed, that's what he was remembering and talking about to us and the hospice caregivers and the volunteers, et cetera. So it's pretty amazing how if you make the right investments, you have less regrets on your deathbed. And Ernesto is a perfect example of that.
Would you maybe want to, you had some at the end of the book, you had some you had an interesting take on time. Maybe you want to just talk about your own like philosophy of how you like view time and like time versus money. I thought that was pretty interesting as well.
I think we confuse time quite a bit, and we try to, what I say, commoditize it. This idea that we can buy and sell it, we can trade it, we can waste it. All these adjectives we use around time, I think actually are inappropriate. You see, time passes no matter what we do, right? It doesn't matter what you do. Time is not something you can change and mold. It just passes. So you really have two options. One is, if we think of life as a series of time slots, whether those are hours, days, minutes, months, years, however you want to look at it, we can better control what we spend doing during those time slots, right? Because those time slots are set and they don't change. That's one thing we can do. Otherwise, we can change our perception of time, which is a lot more difficult. So when it comes to figuring out what we spend our time doing during those time slots, it behooves us to start thinking about meaning and purpose early on in life, right? And so we can figure out what's meaningful. And my goal is to help people spend as many of those time slots doing meaningful and purposeful things, and as few of those time slots doing things they don't like or specifically hate. And so the idea is to look at your life and eventually build a financial framework in which you subtract out all those things you don't like and add in all those things you do like, and then try to build a financial framework that supports that, right? So that's the end goal, is fill those time slots with purpose, identity, and connections to the greatest ability. The only other issue to think about is this idea of how we perceive time as different at different times of our life. So think about this. For young people, it seems like time is expansive and goes on forever. If you remember when you were a little kid, you would wait and wait and wait to, be a year older or go to the next grade, right? And it seemed forever. Yet as you get older, time seems to fly. So there's a philosophy about how we make money. There's some people who are willing to work really hard in their early 20s and grind it out, even at things they don't like, to make a lot of money. So you can put that money in the stock market, let it compound, and then retire as early as possible. So you're messing with time perception there. What you're doing is you're taking those years where time seems vast and readily available and trying to do all the hard work then, so you have a lot of money, so that when you get to later in life, when time is flying by, you can be retired and spend all your time doing exactly what you want to be doing. You can enjoy that time more, even if it seems to be flying by you. So that's the idea, is we can control what we put in those time slots, and we can mess around a little bit with our perceptions of time by trying to change the way we work and do things. But otherwise, we have no control over it. It is not a commodity. You can't buy it. You can't sell it. You can't exchange money for it. But what we can do is use money as a tool to pay people to do those things we don't want to do, so that we can do what we want to do in those time slots. And that's really my goal of how we look at time.
So you kind of used the three brothers as an example, and I think you just described the eldest brother. Can you describe the middle child and the youngest on their paths to financial independence as well?
Certainly. So as I was saying, the first part really of the book is working on this idea of purpose, identity, connections. But once you start getting in touch with your purpose, identity, and connections, really the next step is building a path to financial independence. And a lot of people, again, get to that point like, well, how the heck do I get to financial independence? And although I would say that there are many, many different paths in the book, I talk about 3 specific paths, and I do it through a story called The Parable of the Three Brothers, right? So there's this idea that there are 3 brothers and they're all embarking on a journey of a lifetime by going down their own separate paths. The eldest brother is the most straightforward and he's the quickest, and he wants to do all the hard work right away because he hates to hike. He just wants to get through his path as soon as he can so he can get to the end so he can do what he wants. And that's the eldest brother. The middle brother wants to get through his path quickly, but is not as strong of a walker. So likes to take rests and flights of fancy, going off in the mountains or out into the fields, taking a break and then coming back, re-energized and getting back on the path. The middle brother gets to the end of the path a little bit later than the eldest brother, but still with lots of time to enjoy his freedom and do whatever he wants. Finally, the youngest brother is different from the other 2. He loves the path, so he takes his time in enjoying the scenery, resting when he needs to. He takes the longest time to get to the end of his path. By the time he's there, the eldest and the middle brother are sitting there waiting for him. They've been loving their freedom for a while. And then the youngest brother does something amazing. He turns around and starts walking back the way he came. And the other brothers are totally confused. And so I like this parable because really it talks about the 3 different ways of getting to financial independence, or at least thinking about our career. That eldest brother is front loading the sacrifice, working really hard, making as much money as you can, getting into the stock market, compounding, and then retiring as early as possible. The idea is you don't work on purpose, identity, and connections during your work life. You hold on to that and wait. You defer gratification until you retire, and then you get all the time in the world to do that. It is the fastest path to financial independence. I shouldn't say that. It's the fastest path to being done with your career or retiring. It isn't per se the fastest path to financial independence. We can talk about the middle and the youngest brother, and you can see they're faster ways to financial independence, but not a faster way to get to the end of your career. The middle brother is the path of passive income or side hustles. These are the people who want to feel some purpose, identity, connections now as well as in the future. So instead of grinding it out, they're going to find passive income sources or side hustles. They define financial independence as having enough money to cover their monthly needs. So once their passive income or side hustle income covers their monthly needs, they're financially independent, but their career actually may last longer. And that's why I say it's actually a longer path than the eldest brother, because even if you have passive income set up or side hustles, you're still going to have to do some maintenance work. You're still going to be working to a later date, but it gives you some free time to start doing those things you want right now. And last but not least, the path of the youngest brother, I call the passion play. That's where if you love what you do and you would do what you're doing, even if you weren't being paid for it, you're financially independent the minute you find a job that pays your monthly bills, because you're really living a life of purpose, identity, connections immediately because you're doing something you're passionate about. It's the fastest path to financial independence, but it's the slowest path to career when we're talking about the 3 brothers and the youngest brother taking the longest to get to the end of his path, because you might have to work till you're 60 or 70, especially if you're not putting anything away for retirement. There are pluses and minuses to all these paths, but traditionally, if you've heard of the FIRE, financially independent, retire early community, they really only looked at the path of the eldest brother. But people are getting wiser and they want to really enjoy their lives today as well as tomorrow. So the paths of the middle and the youngest brother are becoming more popular. The truth of the matter is it doesn't matter which one you take, and you can mix and match and use little bits of each. But the idea is to bring purpose, identity, connections into your life sooner than later and build a financial framework around them. So again, you can go back to filling as many of those time slots as possible with things that are meaningful to you in the end. And that's kind of the goal of any of the brothers' paths. But I like those 3 different paths because they kind of break down 3 different ways to look at financial independence.
I guess, how would you describe which brother you were, and did that, I guess, caricature change over time?
It definitely did. So like the real world, you know, you don't have to be one brother your whole life. You can change from time to time. So my father died when he was 40 and I was 7, and he was a cancer doctor. And so I wanted to be a doctor just like him. So from a very young age, I wanted to be a doctor regardless of what it paid. I had no interest in money. I just had this one main goal. So I started as youngest brother, and that carried me through college and medical school and residency. But at some point I started burning out in medicine, and I started thinking I need to make enough money as fast as possible to get out of this field so that I can start, living, doing what I really wanted to do. So immediately I went from being an eldest brother, or excuse me, a youngest brother to an eldest brother. I just wanted to grind it out, make as much money as I could, put in the stock market, and then get out. But in the process of trying to make more money, I started looking at side hustles. One of those was hospice, where I would be hired for a monthly stipend to be a director of one of the hospice teams. And so in a sense, I also took on some traits of the middle brother. So again, this shows that we don't necessarily have to stick to one path, but if we're intentional about realizing what these different paths are and using them as we need to, we can ultimately get to our financial goals faster and therefore live the life we want to live.
So yeah, you mentioned, just sort of as a personal anecdote, you mentioned the burnout of medical school. I mean, I went to grad school for chemistry, and I also very much have felt that burnout as well. So I've sort of seen a similar transition from, I guess, as you would describe, the youngest to the eldest, as well. But I guess I just had a sort of a question about your personal opinion on you talk about the this 4% withdrawal rate for once you sort of hit, I guess, FI and you're looking to withdraw money. I guess just my question is, like, do you worry? Because when I read that, I always worry that if, and you even talk about in the book, if there's a massive stock market crash, like how, if you're at the retirement age, how do you really recover from that? That's just something I've always sort of worried about when I read those analysis.
So the safe withdrawal rate of 4% really relies on data taken from the Trinity study. And they looked at, if you looked at different 30-year periods throughout history, what withdrawal rate could you take on a regular basis from your invested assets and still have either money left over or at least survive to the end of 30 years? They found in almost any scenario, even during the Great Depression and the worst scenarios out there, that something like, I think it was 4.1 actually in the end, was safe even in the worst case scenarios. So it's true, if you withdraw 4% from your portfolio all the time, and if you happen to have the really bad luck of those first few years that you are withdrawing, you have a horrible stock market crash, right? They call it sequence of returns. So if your sequence of returns is bad, in other words, after 30 years, you might have returns of 8 to 10%. But if in the first bunch of years, you have a negative 20% return, and then it goes way up, the problem is it kind of kills the starting fuel you start with. And therefore, the amount of money that you have to compound over time decreases in the way beginning, and therefore you'll end up with a lot less money. This is always a possibility. And that's why we say the 4% safe withdrawal rate is a rule of thumb as opposed to a true rule. Because everyone's different, right? Some people have kids, some don't. Some people have kids who are going to college. Some people know they're going to have medical expenses. There are all sorts of things you can take in, add, take away, etc. The idea is we all have to look at this individually for ourselves, but it's a great place to start. And if you believe the numbers, pretty much you're going to win 99% of the time if you stick to that 4% safe withdrawal rate. But even if you don't, it's amazingly easy for a lot of us, especially professionals who are talking about retiring early. So I'm not talking about the people who traditionally retire at 70 or 80, but we're talking about people who are looking at 40 or 50, they want to retire. Most of us still have skills where we could go back into the workforce. And let's say you just make a few $1,000, $10,000, $15,000 a year. That'll take your safe withdrawal rate for most people down from a 4% to a 3%, which is ultimately much more stable. So this idea that if you were paying attention every year and watching what's happening to the market, you could adjust or pivot or find some alternate income streams that don't have to be nearly what you were making in your main working years and yet still survive and do well. So I think it's true, whenever we stick our hat on one specific number, there's always a risk that the stock market could change or do something we've never seen before. But when you add in the ability to pivot and someone who's willing to pay attention to their numbers, the likelihood of failure really goes down quite a bit.
And I guess that touches to the point of just always being diversified and having different asset classes to draw from, whether it's real estate or other hobbies that produce income. I mean, you even touch on, the one-legged, I think it's a flamingo versus, I guess if you could touch on that too, that analogy.
We talk about the dining room table, right, as the model for how we should be diversified. This idea that if you put all your eggs in one basket, you obviously are going to be at high risk for losing all your money. So if you think about the dining room table as the goal, the standard. You know, you have people out there who are like the single-legged flamingo, right? This is someone who works at a company and all they own maybe a stock in that company, and they get their pay from that company and they get all their benefits from that company. And of course, what happens if that company goes bankrupt or something bad happens? It cuts that one leg out, and basically that's their whole financial future. You know, you can add in maybe some stocks and bonds, some diversification, an S&P 500 index. Now you go from a flamingo to a two-legged stool. It's a little bit safer, but still kind of totters in the wind. Not exactly the best thing. If you take that and then maybe you add some real estate holdings, now you're getting to some real stability, right? You've got three different legs. You've got some S&P 500 index. Maybe you've got some stock in your own company. Now you've got some real estate. Maybe you want to make it more stable and throw in a side hustle there. There's all sorts of ways you can go, but the idea is when you've got 4 different revenue streams or at least 4 safety valves, you're a lot likely to be stable. And then if one of those legs gets kicked out, you still have a financial plan that will stand. And so that's the real whole idea. Back to this idea of the safe withdrawal rate, you know, everyone is afraid that they're going to run out of money, but very few people worry about running out of life. And sometimes all you have to do is switch this idea. If you look at the 4% safe withdrawal rate and say, you know what, there's a 98% chance I'm going to succeed. That ain't so bad. But the risk of running out of life could be huge. And we get no numbers that are nearly that safe for living into the future. So I think you just got to weigh the different risks.
And I think for Americans, one thing like with early retirement is kind of solving the healthcare issue. I mean, you touch a little bit on it, but what would you recommend, or what have you seen in terms of people retiring early and how they purchase healthcare?
So, I mean, there are a few different ways to do this. You know, the most straightforward is to just budget it into your retirement plan, right? So if you look at what your yearly spending is and figure out a safe withdrawal rate from that, you might have to budget 10, 15, sometimes up to $20,000 a year just for healthcare. That's one way, right? The other way is also to realize that if you truly decide to retire early and you have very little income, as of today, you still can use the Accountable Care Act. You can still sign up for health insurance through the government, and you would get very good subsidies. So the cost of a basic healthcare plan for your average person who has no income is going to be, you know, $100, $200, maybe $300 a month. It's not going to be nearly as bad as people think it'll be. Assuming that neither of those work for you for some reason, you can't pay out of pocket because it's too expensive, and you don't qualify for the ACA and getting it through the government, there are some other ways to do it. There are health sharing ministries. That is a way that some people are using. Religious communities, even if you're not amazingly religious, but you have to follow their criteria. Health sharing ministries can save you on cost quite a bit, but they're not exactly insurance, so you have to read the fine print. A number of people are also, if you are free and young and you don't have kids or those kind of things, a lot of people are moving to different countries, right? So another thought process is if you're 50, you're married, you want to leave work, you could move to somewhere like Mexico where you could get permanent residence fairly easy. And once you get permanent residence, you qualify for their health plan, which is pretty cheap. And then on top of that, even if you do have to pay out of pocket, you know, an emergency room visit in a place like Mexico could be $100 or $200, whereas in the United States, that could be $2,000 to $5,000. So it's a big difference. None of the options are perfect, but there are some options out there if you're willing to look for them.
I guess on sort of that last note with moving to Mexico, I think you called that in the book, was it geographical arbitrage? Was that the correct term?
Geo-arbitrage is the term. Yeah.
Right. So you want to maybe sort of just not even with healthcare, but just in general, how that can change your entire like outlook on money and how it can affect your spending.
Yeah, I mean, look at this idea. Let's say that you spend $100,000 a year, right? So based on, or if you're spending $100,000 a year, based on that number, to feel safe retiring, you'd probably need at least $2.5 million. That's in the United States. A lot of people move to Mexico where they can live on half of that and still get all the same things, right? So if you go to Mexico and you live on $50,000 a year, then maybe you need $1.25 million, which is half, right? We're talking half the $2.5 million that you would need to feel comfortable with 30 plus years of retirement without ever making money again. So think about the huge difference of just living in another country would make, the cost of everything is much less.
I guess just also, as you're talking about half, I just sort of thought about, it seems like we're in a very high inflationary environment right now. I guess how would you plan for, I guess, future inflation when you're looking at how much money you need for retirement?
Well, here's the beauty of it. Yes, we're in a high inflationary period now, but we're not always going to be in a high inflationary period. So if you think about it, in my opinion, the best hedge of inflation is actually investing in the stock market, right? Because if you own these large swaths of the US stock market, how do these companies survive? Well, inflation is going up as these companies are charging more for their goods and services. So if you own a piece of those companies, even during inflationary periods, your stock is becoming more valuable. You're actually making more money. So long term, people who are financial independents, retire early people who have front loaded the sacrifice a little bit and have a lot of money already invested in the stock market and are living off of it, are going to naturally do well both in inflationary and non-inflationary periods. But when you're not working anymore, actually, inflation affects you less, right? Because you're not making that commute to work. Remember, how much do we spend on gas going to and from work, especially if you're 35, 40 minutes, an hour from work? All that money you pay on gas, you don't necessarily have to pay when you're retired, right? Work clothes, right? How much do we spend on work clothes? How much do we spend on meals when we're at the office and we go out to eat with everyone? All these things are cut down. So I would tell you that retired people actually are hit by inflation less just because they can modify their lifestyle more. Whereas young workers are the ones who really get killed by it, and especially because they don't have lots of equity investments, the young people. So again, they're not benefiting long-term the way those who already have a complex portfolio are.
I guess I'm curious, have you ever done any like medical rounds in other countries? Because I guess I was from, I mean, my American perspective, maybe it's just a fear of the unknown, but what are these other medical systems like, and how would you assess the care in other countries?
So for one, me personally, there are lots of expat communities. So I'm not sure if you're asking me this or you're saying someone who is evaluating these possibilities, how would they figure that out? Well, there's tons and tons of expat communities. So in places like Mexico, a lot of the doctors are trained in the US. They actually go to the US, get their training, and then move back to Mexico. Same in many parts of Europe. So what we're finding actually is the American healthcare system is probably more expensive and not necessarily better, especially for day-to-day and month-to-month care. So you could argue if you have complex cancer treatment or if you have some kind of complex surgery, you might want to come back to the US for that. But basic care is just as good in most countries and a lot less expensive and probably better in some countries. So I would tell you that your likelihood, especially if you're looking at some of these large expat communities, right? You have a bunch in Europe in places like Portugal, you have a bunch in South and Central America in places like Costa Rica and places like Mexico, et cetera. A lot of people are moving there. So in a sense, the demand drives good care too, because you've got a lot of people who are willing to pay for it. So you have popping up in these communities, pretty nice medical centers.
So I guess just personal question, would you ever consider, I guess, moving to another country?
Oh yeah, I definitely would. So I have kids. My daughter is 15. My son is 18. My son's going to be going to college next year. My daughter just started freshman year of high school. But once my son and daughter are out of the house, I would definitely consider at least spending half the year in Mexico. I love Mexico myself, and it has such vibrant expat communities. I just got back from a conference where I spent time with a couple who lives in Lake Chapala, Mexico, which is a very well-known expat community there, and they love it. And most people that I know who live in those communities are very happy with them.
I guess what else is on your bucket list as you starting to assess purpose and all this good stuff?
So it's funny. I don't mind the term bucket list, but actually bucket list to me denotes single events that you check off and can go do. And when it comes to purpose and identity, I think more of these kind of long-term plans, these things that sustain us and fulfill us for long-term. So not exactly bucket list items. So I'll tell you what I love. I love podcasting. Like I could spend tons of time doing that. I love the process. Don't get me wrong. I'd love my podcast to be listened to by millions and millions of people, but even if it wasn't, I love the process of having these deep, important conversations with people. So to me, purpose looks a lot like continuing to communicate, to podcast, to write, to go to conferences. I do a lot of public speaking. I've been doing more of it recently, especially with the book coming out. Those things feel very purposeful for me, above and beyond the things that I think we all have, like spending time with family. And I'm not a huge travel person, but I certainly would like to travel more and get to see more of the world. But for me, it's that connection with people, like going to conferences, talking about important things, just connecting to people who think similarly to you, whether it's about finances or about life in general. I mean, that's what I really dig. And that's what looks like a good life to me.
I guess just sort of from the financial standpoint, when you started sort of transitioning from being a doctor to sort of more of like a personal finance blogger and podcaster, were you finding like you were giving a lot of advice to other doctors in the beginning? Because I found that it seems like a lot of the doctors, or I guess young doctors that I know, tend to not have a strong grasp on a lot of financial aspects.
Let's be clear, very much no one has a strong grasp on financial aspects, right? So it's a very, very small percentage of population who thinks deeply about these things. But doctors are in a unique situation where they go into huge amounts of debt and then go sometimes to a career that they burn out in fast, like I did. And that creates a specific type of problem, right? How do you pay off all those debts when the main driver of you making money to pay off those debts is the skill that you maybe no longer want to use or aren't finding as gratifying as you thought it would be? So I talk to a lot of doctors. There are actually a lot of doctors in the personal finance community. You would never know it until you were part of that community, but the doctor financial independence and doctor personal finance communities are large and vibrant, and there's a lot of people there. And that's not just physicians, but dentists, physical therapists, occupational therapists, allied healthcare in general. You've got a lot of people who are kind of in this space. And but there are many, many millions more who still need to learn these messages of what role money plays in our life and how to organize their finances so that they can do the things they want to do.
I mean, when you kind of talk about like the art of subtraction, like I think some of these high earners just think they can outsource the financial aspect. How would you, I guess, respond to them? Like, should they take ownership more so in their finances?
So I was exactly that, right? I figured I'm a doctor. My time
Yeah.
isn't too important. Let someone else do the money. A few things changed my mind on that. One is I realized that only you really know your true goals. So even if you have a financial advisor or what have you, you should still know exactly what they're doing and why, because only you are going to understand your financial goals. And pushing it off to someone else, the likelihood they're going to be as careful and they're going to know what you want is just smaller. I think that's part of it. The other part of it that most people don't understand is understanding your finances probably takes a few hours of studying every month. Like, we're not talking about days. We're not talking about weeks. We're talking about 2 to 3 hours a month. If you put your mind to it, you can understand your finances within 6 months for the rest of your life. And so I think we mislead ourselves because we don't want to spend the time or energy. I think it scares us. And just like everything else that scares us, the easiest thing to do is to hand it off to someone else. But I think if you have the courage not to, you'll find that you are better able to dictate what you do and don't do in your life because you'll have a better control of your money. And money is that ultimate tool, right? It helps us do things that we truly want to do. And so if you start taking control of money, you can start being a lot more thoughtful about what activities you put in those time slots, I guess, if I want to put into my own terminology.
Back to the financial advisors, it sounded like you were suggesting that you try and pay them as an hourly rate. Was I understanding that correctly?
There are many different ways to pay a financial advisor. And the truth of the matter is, ultimately, you want to find someone who really you believe in and trust and who can support you and listens to you. So regardless of how they get paid, that's the most important if you're going to use a financial advisor. But it is true, like, financial advisors get paid in different ways. And there's so many different ways that a financial advisor can get paid. But one is that they sell you products, right? So you don't pay them any cash yourselves, but they sell you specific products. And when you buy them to be put in part of your portfolio, they get paid a little percentage of that. So if you think about it, the incentive is to sell you whatever pays them the most, even if it's not necessarily a good investment. So that's no good, right? Then there's something called assets under management. So what that means is they get paid based on how much of your money they manage, right? So if they manage $100,000, they get a certain percentage. If they manage $200,000, they get a certain percentage. The problem with that is, first and foremost, that advisor's only going to want you to invest in the stock market that they can manage, right? They're not going to want you to go start businesses. They're not going to want you to go buy real estate because they won't get a piece of any of that, right? And the truth of the matter is, a lot of the times, once you hit past, let's say 100,000 or 200,000 or $1 million, they're really doing the same work regardless of how much money you make. So if you really build your investments up, you're paying them more and more every year because you have more money, but they're really not doing anything different. They're just pretty much saying 20% here, 50% here, 30% there, et cetera. So it's a decent way to work with an advisor, but it's not perfect. In my mind, one of the best ways is when you just pay a straight fee. You say, I'm going to either pay you this much to set up a financial plan, or I'm going to pay you this much monthly or yearly to manage things, regardless of how much assets under management, regardless of what I decide to put my money in, because that takes away all the conflicts of interest, right? Then their only interest is keeping you happy and keeping you as a client, because they're either going to get paid that amount or they're not. And it all depends on how happy you are. So I think that's a really good way to work with a financial advisor if you can find one. But ultimately, the most important thing, regardless of what model they use to get paid, is that you find a person who understands you and that you trust. And so if you can find that right person, to me, I would go work with any of them, regardless of how they got paid, if you really believed in that person and that they were out for your own good.
So Jordan, this is kind of a question that I think me and a lot of listeners are kind of hesitant to bring up, but like when we're having those end of life discussions with like parents or grandparents, I mean, you talk about having an in case of emergency binder. I thought that's the first time I've heard of that concept, I guess. Could you go into that a little and maybe how to bring up those tough conversations that need to be had?
So two separate things. The ICE binder, in case of emergency binder, is one of those important things that we often overlook. So often you have one family member who manages all the finances. And the problem is, usually they manage the finances because they're good at it or they're interested in it. And then you have another spouse or other family members who are not interested in it. So you have one person who holds all the financial knowledge, maybe pays all the bills, knows where all the money is, knows where all the insurance policies are. And then what happens if they die suddenly? All of a sudden, no one else knows any of the passwords. They don't know where the money is. They don't know how to access the money. They don't know what the insurance policies are. So there's this thing called an in case of emergency binder. What it is, and there's many of them that are commercially available, is it just helps you write down and codify all your important financial information. So God forbid something happens to you, a family member could open this up and know where all the accounts are, all the passwords are, all the insurances are, and therefore they would know what to do with your life. We see all the time people who could have used this and didn't. I'll give you two examples. I have a person who I talk about in my book whose husband died in his 30s suddenly of a heart attack. And to add injury to insult, when she went looking into his insurance policy, she realized that he had dated someone 10 years before and had never changed the beneficiary. So even though he had married and now had a child with the person that now was his widow, the insurance policy actually paid out to an ex-girlfriend who was nice enough to hand over the money. But if they had had an ICE binder, one of the things the ICE binder does is it asks you to write down and make sure all your beneficiaries are set. So an ICE binder would have solved that problem, because in the process of filling it out, this gentleman would have realized that he hadn't updated his beneficiary in 10 years and would have gone back and done that. Another great case, and we see this all the time, is what'll happen is someone will die and they'll have an expensive coin collection or baseball card collection or something, and it'll be locked up in an impenetrable vault that they have, right? A safe that they have in their garage. How many people have a safe somewhere in the garage or hidden in their house? And they never tell anyone the password. And then they die and no one can get to their stuff. It's almost laughable, except that it happens all the time. So in case of emergency binders are important. The second part of that question that you asked is, how do we have these tough conversations? And God knows, especially we who are in our age group, really it's to have these tough conversations with our parents, because our parents are getting older. They have lots of open financial issues and no one's talking about them. And yet if you do nothing, it can blow up in our faces. A big question is, how do we discuss with our parents their financial issues without having them feel like we're either after their money or just having an uncomfortable conversation they don't want to have? In the book, I have a chapter where we talk a lot about this, and I give a few conversation starters. And so there's some really easy ways to bring up the conversation of your parents and their money and how they're planning for death or disability or God knows what happens in the future. The first question is to ask for their advice, right? So even if you know what you're doing with your own estate planning, a beautiful way to get your parents involved and start asking them and trying to get a feel for what they're doing with their money is say, hey, I just met with my estate planning lawyer and I'm trying to figure out my beneficiaries and my money and all this stuff. Should I set up a trust? Shouldn't I set up a trust? What did you do? Right. So this gives them a chance to actually give you parental advice. So they're much more likely to open up and talk about their own experiences. And so that might be one of the easiest ways to figure out where your parents are is by asking them for advice, even if you don't need it, because it's a great conversation starter. Another really good conversation starter is to bring up someone who's had a bad episode happen because they didn't plan well. So in the book, I talk about a gentleman whose father was taking care of his mother, and his mother had Alzheimer's, and the father had been really diligent and taking care of everything. And the father had power of attorney and financial power of attorney, and he was managing the mother's care. And then the father got COVID and got put on a ventilator. That was really tragic, not only because the father was sick, but the son wanted to go and then start paying the bills for the mom while the father was sick. And he realized he had no control over their bank accounts. And he didn't have the financial power of attorney because they had never really specified that. And so financial power of attorney is important because if someone doesn't die, but they're incapacitated, you need someone else to manage their finances. And if you haven't specified another person, the only way for that other person to do it is to go to court and do something called conservatorship, which is exceedingly expensive and time consuming. Whereas if they had done the right paperwork with the lawyers when they were doing their original estate plan, the son would get access, he would have financial power of attorney, and he could make those decisions. Once a person dies, then it goes to the will. So financial power of attorney only works when people are still living. But in this case, that was one of those episodes where if they had been more thoughtful, they could have avoided this tragedy. And so if you're trying to bring this conversation up with your parents, you can say, hey, remember my friend Doug? Well, the darndest thing happened when his mom had Alzheimer's and then his dad got sick and got put on a ventilator in COVID. Doug couldn't pay the bills because he had no access to the money. Boy, I really hope that never happens to us. Have we ever sat down and thought about what would happen if one of you guys got sick? So again, using a story or an example of someone else who's experienced something bad is a great way to start the conversation. So those are two ways, right? One, asking for advice. Two, telling a story of someone who had something bad happen. And then the last one is to really talk about legacy. And this is the most straightforward approach, is to look at your parents and say, hey, you know what? I'm having kids now, and I've been thinking a lot about what I'm going to leave my kids. How are they going to remember me as they get older, as I have grandchildren? And it made me start thinking about you. Like, how do you want us to remember you? What kind of things do you want us to do after you die that makes us think of you? Remember that, that cabin we all go to year after year that you bring all the kids and the grandkids to? What happens when you die? Do you want us to still go there? Like, do you want us to celebrate all these years we did this? And if you do you want to put some money away so that there's money to pay for it and to keep it up and et cetera, et cetera? So this is a great way, as opposed to saying, hey, what are you going to do with your money and how much of it is going to us? It's better to ask them what they think of as their legacy. And this can be their stories, but it can also be the things, right? What things do you want to pass on to what people so they remember you and can think about you even after you're gone? So those are three good ways, I think, to talk about estate planning, especially with your parents, that broaches the subject without it being awkward.
So I think you touched on a couple of these, but so I guess when you're at the end of life, like court documents that you would recommend having would be sort of like a living will and then the power of attorney and both the financial and I believe you also brought up a medical power of attorney as well. Is that correct?
Right. So it's a little confusing. I like to break them down into the financial legacy documents. I call them legacy as opposed to estate planning because I really think they're about legacies. You have financial legacy documents and then your medical legal legacy documents. Your financial legacy documents are things like your will and trust, right? So your will is basically what goes to court or probate so they can figure out what you want done with your things. Trusts are a little complicated for this conversation, but it's a way, again, to push your assets in one direction or another without them going to court. Things like financial power of attorney are very important, especially before someone dies, right? So that in case something were to happen and someone was to be incapacitated, someone could then make decisions with their money. The medical legal documents then look at things like your living will, right, which is different than your will. Your will talks about your assets once you're dead. Your living will talks about the things you'd want done to you if you became sick. Like, would you want to be on life support? Would you want a feeding tube? Those kind of things. So living will is part of that. Something called the DNR, do not resuscitate or post form. These are all things that help people decide what medical care you would or wouldn't want. Then there's the medical power of attorney, right? So you want to make sure that there's someone who can make medical decisions for you. In most states, there is actually a descending line of order. So if a spouse is sick, then the other spouse automatically becomes their medical power of attorney. After that, it's usually the oldest child, blah, blah, blah. But especially if you don't want one of those people to be your medical power of attorney, or you want to specifically specify, then there's a medical power of attorney form, et cetera. So that's just kind of the basics. Is they're kind of the financial legacy documents and the medical legal ones. And you want to make sure you're looking at both.
So for the living will, is there if you don't have a living will, is there just default care that is gone to?
So there is, if you don't have a living will, one of two things happens. Either they just do everything up until they can't do everything, right? So it's full court press, even if it's futile. That's one. The other thing, though, is you do still have a medical power of attorney. So your medical power of attorney can make decisions for you. So whether you specify in the living will or not, your medical power of attorney can say, okay, we're done. We're not doing anymore. What gets difficult, and this is why it's important not just to have a medical power of attorney, to really talk to them, is there are times when your living will says one thing, like I'd like to be on life support for 2 weeks, et cetera, et cetera. And then your medical power of attorney can try to override it and say, no, we want to stop everything now. So it's unclear legally which one has the right say. So ultimately, your living will is supposed to take precedence, but what I've seen in the hospitals, people pretty much go with the medical power of attorney. So you just want to make sure your medical power of attorney is very aware of what your wishes are, and you can put them in that living will, but really nothing is as good as sitting down and talking to your medical power of attorney and really having those conversations about, this is what I'd want, this is what I wouldn't want, because ultimately you can't guess at what every situation will be, but the more conversations you have with a medical power of attorney, more likely they'll be able to make decisions that are appropriate for you when the time comes.
I guess I'm a little confused with why would, even though you just sort of said legally the living will should override the medical power of attorney, but why are you seeing, I guess, the opposite?
So I could give you lots of reasons for that, but the truth of the matter is a living will is a static document, and a medical power of attorney can pivot and change and make decisions as new information comes in. So I think a living will, people like to follow it, but ultimately a person who can look at all the information, take it into account, and then make a decision often is what the medical team will go with regardless.
Okay.
Interesting. Well, Al, do you have any more questions? Or
I mean, I wrote down, you had this quote, perfect is the enemy of good.
that's good.
I don't know if did you actually come up with that? Because I absolutely loved that quote.
I can't take credit for that. I mean, I've heard it before, but I think it's a real important one, especially in almost everything we do, and specifically in investing in our money. If you make it to 80% there, you're actually going to be fine most of the time. And spending more time and energy on that last few percentage points really probably wastes our energy when we should be focusing on other things.
Yeah.
Awesome.
So I guess, at the end of the day, we are a books podcast, and you mentioned a couple. You mentioned the five top wishes of the dying, and then the 4-Hour Work Week, which I know both Jack and I have read. I guess, do you have any other book recommendations that you would, sort of suggest?
I mean, I have so many. A lot of them are financial books because I think they've changed my life. The big one, The White Coat Investor by Jim Daly, was the one that I read. So if you're a high net worth individual, or specifically doctor, dentist, someone in healthcare, it's a great book to read about finances. J.L. Collins, my good friend, wrote The Simple Path to Wealth. Fantastic book about finances. Grant Sabatier, another good friend of mine, wrote Financial Freedom, another great book about general finances, side hustling, and how to go from $0 to $1 million in a very short number of years. All of those I would highly suggest. Great reads.
Awesome. Well, Jordan, thanks so much. Where can people go to find more about you, and where can they get the book?
The best way to find out about me, the book, as well as my multiple platforms, because I have a medical blog, I have a financial podcast, and a financial blog. And The easiest way to learn about those as well as the book is go to jordangrumet.com. That's JORDANGRUMET.com.
Well, thanks so much. And with that, please reach out to us at brothersonbooks@gmail.com for any book recommendations, or if you'd like to be a guest host for a particular book you have in mind. A great review or rating on whichever platform you're listening to this would be greatly appreciated. And lastly, if you can think of any friend, family member, or coworker that might like this episode, please pass it along. Jordan, thanks so much. And Al, see you next time.
See you, Jack. See you, Jordan. Thanks for coming on.
Thanks for having me, guys.